Hey, I'm Jonathan Haupt. I'm the executive director of the nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center in Beaufort, South Carolina, coming to you for this special presentation in partnership with the Morris Center for Low Country Heritage. This is a program called Pat Conroy as a Lifelong Learner, and it's a lecture I originally put together for OSHER, a Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of South Carolina, Beaufort, and I've gotten to do it many times across South Carolina and Georgia since. For the sake of this virtual program, we're going to do a slightly abbreviated version of the talk, and I hope you enjoy it. Pat Conroy was the author of 12 books, 11 published during his lifetime, and then the 12th, The Low Country Heart, after he passed away. 4 of those books were made into major motion pictures, and what all 12 of them have in common is recurring themes of education. Pat was forever interested in the lives of students, teachers, and mentors because that was so central to his own life. The son of a highly decorated Marine Corps fighter pilot and a complicated and largely self-educated Southern belle, Pat Conroy was the oldest of 7 siblings, and 3 of those Conroy siblings went on to become published authors, not just Pat. When the Conroys came to Beaufort in 1961, it was the 23rd time the family had moved since Pat had been born, and Beaufort High School was the 10th school that Pat went to. He was about to enter the 11th grade. He had always been the shy, awkward kid everywhere he had been, and he hadn't had much time to make friends or capture the attention of any of his teachers. But all of that changed at Beaufort High, where Pat met a remarkable group of teachers, many of whom went on to become lifelong mentors to Pat. Among them was the high school principal, Bill Duffert, who showed Pat what it meant to be a leader in a community. Pat's junior year English teacher, Gene Norris, showed Pat what it might look like to become a teacher himself. And Ann Head, well-known novelist who was living in Beaufort at the time, was Pat's creative writing teacher, and she showed Pat what life as a professional writer might look like as well. Pat was so inspired by his teachers and the lives of service that they were living that when he graduated from the Citadel in 1967, he came back to Beaufort High, in fact, where he began teaching. In his first years at Beaufort High, Pat was teaching government and psychology and what may have been the first African American studies class taught in any public school in the state of South Carolina. Pat didn't publish much writing about his time teaching at Beaufort High School, although that was a theme of the novel he was working on when he passed away. But every so often among his published pieces you find a gem, like this short piece appearing in an essay in A Low Country Heart. I consider the 2 years in Beaufort when I taught high school as perhaps the happiest time of my life. My attraction to melodrama and suffering had not yet overwhelmed me, but signs were surfacing. No one had warned me that a teacher could fall so completely in love with his students that graduation seemed like the death of a small civilization. The first love of Pat Conroy's writing life was poetry. From the time he was a teenager, Pat wanted very much to be a poet, and he was in fact published for the first time in Breaker's literary magazine while a student at Beaufort High School. Pat continued to write poetry while he was a student at the Citadel, being published in their literary magazine, The Shako. In both high school and college, Pat was not only a writer for the literary magazine, but also an editor, because he wanted to be a writer who helped other writers. Well, when Pat returned to teach at Beaufort High, his ambition to become a poet was still very active, and he was still writing poetry, but frustrated that he wasn't writing the quality of poetry that he wanted to write. But here's an example of a good and unpublished poem from Pat Conroy's years as a teacher at Beaufort High School. This is a poem written in honor of Pat's longtime best friend, Bernie Shine, who at that point was, like Pat, a young teacher. This is Bernie. The bright crystal cruets of your smiling gave refreshment in a land of desert people, and the world sings, a bird-heavy world, all cymbals and chime, and children clap to tambourines hysterically mastered by circus chimps, and the symphony begins here, a maestro with a silver laugh who sings an aria of gladness, a face of singing, mourning, and the ballerinas dancing only for the love of the dance and the world. And while the Bernie poem shows the promise of the writer Pat will eventually become, many of his poems from this era simply didn't. Here's Pat writing about his frustration as a poet. This is from an unpublished journal entry. I turned to poetry, and for the next year I ground out poem after poem. They rolled off the beltway like doomed Edsels, shimmering with adjectives, golden with metaphor, moist with youth-like embryos, like babies glistening on birthing tables. All this time, I was desperate to find out how a young writer begins his career, what marks the beginning of the ritual when a human is transformed into a writer. I needed a name or a telephone number. I would wear a beret, practice transcendental meditation, fight bulls in Spain. I needed a formula, but most of all, I needed time. After 2 years of teaching at Beaufort High School, Pat has the opportunity to go out to Defusky Island in the 1969-1970 school year, where he is not only the first white school teacher, but also the first male school teacher. He has 18 students, grades 5 through 8, in the two-room Merrifield schoolhouse. And there he discovers that separate has not been equal at all, and these students, through no fault of their own, have been denied a level of education equal to their white counterparts. Pat commits himself fully to giving them such an education. What he's not able to do at that time, however, is write more poetry. Instead, Pat is first and foremost a teacher. And for being such an amazing teacher in the time, his reward is to be fired a year later by the school superintendent and the school board. And this becomes the opportunity for Pat to write his first teaching memoir, The Water is Wide. While The Water is Wide is working its way toward publication, another teacher friend of Pat's, Tim Belk, introduces Pat to the poetry of James Dickey. A book called Poems 1957-1967 becomes incredibly important to Pat, and Dickey at that point had also written Deliverance, his first novel, which was being made into a film. Dickey was teaching at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, and Pat realized that if he was going to be a poet, if he was going to be serious about it, this would be his one chance to take a class with a master poet and see if he could really do it before The Water is Wide came out, and Pat risked being categorized as a writer of prose only. So in the fall of 1972, Pat Conroy wrote a letter to James Dickey in Columbia, telling him how much he enjoyed his poetry and how much he wanted to audit this class with Dickey at USC. Dickey wrote back this very brief letter, which Pat Conroy always kept near his desk, and now we have it on display in our Conroy Center. And let me read it to you. This is dated September 1st, 1972. Dear Pat Conroy, thank you for your recent note and for the things you are kind enough to say about my work. If you want to sit in on one of my classes, it's fine with me, but you'll have to take care of the administrative details with the English department or whoever handles such things. Sincerely, James Dickey. Pat Conroy was mesmerized by James Dickey as a poet, and here's how he described that experience. When I read James Dickey, I'm transported into that ecstatic country where poetry and poetry alone can take you and shake you and change you with the cutting beauty and hammerlock of its language. But it was in Dickey's class that Pat began to realize he was never going to be the kind of poet he truly aspired to be. He was never going to be as good of a poet as he thought James Dickey was. And here's how Pat described that experience and a valuable lesson he learned. I loved his poetry more than anyone else's, and I still wanted to see if I could be a poet. Dickey told me I was not a poet in that class. He broke the news to me by saying, "You're not a poet." And indeed, perhaps Mr. Dickey was that blunt with Pat Conroy. In Pat's journal entries from this time in his life, we see the beginnings of several poems, rough and abandoned ultimately. In the back of those journals, we start to see some prose pieces, short stories, other excerpts beginning to take shape as Pat starts to make a transition from wanting to be a poet to trying to take everything he loved about poetry and transfer it to prose, the beautiful lyrical descriptive language of it all. Somewhere in one of those journals, in a margin, Pat wrote this, which perhaps Mr. Dickey said, perhaps Pat arrived at it entirely on his own. Find the rhythm of your language and stick with it. And that's exactly what Pat Conroy began to do. And Pat Conroy never wrote another poem again, right? Well, wrong, obviously. In Pat's first novel, The Great Santini, the book concludes with something that falls kind of between a prayer and a poem from the perspective of Ben Meacham on the death of his father and his vision of what God might look like. In Pat's novel, The Lords of Discipline, the character of Will McLean, the protagonist, is a poet at his military college, just as Pat had been at the Citadel, and Pat recycles several poems that he wrote as a Citadel cadet in the voice of his protagonist. But by the 1980s, when Pat is working on The Prince of Tides, he's got this character, Savannah Wingo, this poet, and he's got to write some poetry in her voice as well. So we get some fantastic poetry appears in that book, written not in the voice of Pat Conroy, but written in the voice of this character he loves so much. This is Savannah's poem from The Prince of Tides. My navies advance through the language, destroyers ablaze at high seas. I soften the island for landings. With words I enlist a dark army. My poems are the war with the world. I blaze with a deep southern magic. The bombardiers taxi at noon. There is a screaming and grief in the mansions, and the moon is a heron on fire. Man wonders, but God decides when to kill the Prince of Tides. While that piece is overtly written as poetry for the book, it's not the only poetic passage that we can find in The Prince of Tides. Indeed, there are many such passages. Here's an often quoted example from the prologue to The Prince of Tides. Very easy to recognize right there. But look what happens when we insert some line breaks into it. A poem magically appears. Let me read it to you. To describe growing up in the low country of South Carolina, I would have to take you to the marsh on a spring day, flush the great blue heron from its silent occupation, scatter marsh hens as we sink to our knees in the mud, open you an oyster with a pocket knife and feed it to you from the shell and say, there, that taste, that's the taste of my childhood. You can find examples like this throughout Pat Conroy's prose writing, where he has managed to take everything he loved about poetry and apply it to his prose writing. I think Mr. Dickey would be very proud of his student, Pat Conroy. For our next example, as Pat is a lifelong learner, we've got to go back in time a decade, from the mid-1980s to the mid-1970s. After The Water is Wide has come out, Pat is simply too controversial to remain in South Carolina. So with his young family, he moved back to Atlanta, the city of his birth, and there his first wife, Barbara, begins a remarkable law career. Pat becomes stay-at-home dad and has a family to take care of. And he realizes that in order to take good care of this family, he's going to have to learn a skill he doesn't have at that point, and that's learning how to cook. At this point, Pat is hanging out at the Old New York bookshop, where he's befriended the owner, Cliff Graubart, and Cliff has become his sort of go-to expert on all things. So Pat asks Cliff about cookbooks that are selling there in the Old New York bookshop. And Cliff knows even less about cooking than Pat does at this point, but Cliff does know which books are popular, and he recommends to Pat an interesting choice, the Escoffier cookbook. This is not a cookbook you should begin with. This is not for beginners or even intermediates. This is effectively the Bible of French cuisine, but it is what Pat Conroy begins his self-taught cooking lessons with, and he takes to it quite naturally, so much so that he becomes interested in taking a real cooking class with a real chef, and he finds his way to another mentor, this woman, Natalie Dupree, who at that point is a rising culinary star in Atlanta, teaching cooking classes in Rich's department store. And here's how Pat Conroy describes one of those classes in an essay all about Natalie that appears in the Pat Conroy cookbook. From the first chapter, titled Natalie Dupree. The first actual cooking teacher who took both my money and my grief for imparting culinary secrets to me was the inimitable, unclassifiable queen of the Southern kitchen, Natalie Dupree. Though Natalie does not know this, she is one of the few people in my life who seems more like a fictional character than a flesh and blood person. When my novel, Beach Music, came out in 1995, I included a couple of recipes in the book, and I tried to impart some of my love of Roman cuisine. Several journalists who wrote about food for newspapers interviewed me about the food angle in the novel, curious about the fact that the book's protagonist, Jack McCall, wrote cookbooks and restaurant reviews. A woman from the Washington Post conducted a delightful interview over the phone, and during our conversation, I had mentioned that I had taken Natalie's course in the cooking school she ran in the old Rich's department store in downtown Atlanta. The woman called Natalie after our interview, and Natalie tracked me down to report on the nature of their conversation. Natalie's voice is deep and musical and seductive. She possesses the rare ability to be both maddening and hilarious in the course of a single sentence. Her character is shifting, ever-changing. She reinvents herself all over again every couple of years. In one way, she seems the same, yet you are aware she is in the process of a complete transformation. When she tells you about her life, you could swear she was speaking of 100 women, not just one. "Pat, darling," Natalie said on the phone, All of my working life, I've been scheming and plotting and dreaming of ways to get an interview with the food editor of the Washington Post. You can imagine my joy when I heard that the food editor of the Post had left a message on my answering machine, and I thought, yes, it's finally happening. Your prayers have been answered, Natalie. That's great, Natalie, I said, not quite knowing where she was going with this. You never know where Natalie is going with a train of thought. You simply know that the train will not be on time, will carry many passengers, and will eventually collide with a food truck stalled somewhere down the line on damaged tracks. Can you imagine my disappointment when I found out that they wanted to interview me about you instead of about me? Natalie said, I admit, Pat, that after I got over the initial shock, it turned suddenly to bitterness. After all, what do I possibly get out of talking about you when I could be talking about my own cookbooks? Naturally, I did not let on a word about what I was really thinking, but I did suggest, very subtly I might add, that she might want to do a feature on me and my work sometime in the future. When were you in my class, Pat? In 1980, I said. I don't remember that. Did you really take my class? Who else was in it? My wife Lenore, Jim Landon, George Lanier, a nice woman who lived on the same floor as my dad in the Darlington apartments. It doesn't ring a bell for me, she said. Was I good? You were wonderful, I said. All my ex-students say that. It must be a gift. You were a great teacher. Pat, you know the way to a young girl's heart, Natalie said, but I want you to know that I'll always be perfectly furious at you for getting into the Washington Post food world before I did. That's my bailiwick, not yours. It'll never happen again, Natalie, I promised. All your bailiwicks will be safe from poor Conroy. Natalie is always worth the price of admission, and I love cooking with her. Disorder follows her around like a spaniel. There is no hum of quiet efficiency in her kitchen to intimidate me as I caramelize the onions or beat the egg whites to a stiff peak. She prides herself on being a hands-on cook, and I have seen her hands dripping with batter, red with blood, and crimson from handling baby beets. Like most good cooks, she is absolutely fearless, taking on each task with gusto, and her conversation mixes well with the mouth-watering aromas rising out of her kitchen as the meal takes shape around us. Here's how Pat Conroy concludes that chapter on Natalie Dupree. Though Natalie Dupree did not remember much about my presence in her class, it marked me forever. I remain her enthusiast, her evangelist, her acolyte, her grateful student. She taught me that cooking and storytelling make the most delightful co-conspirators. Natalie went on to win the James Beard Award 5 times, including for this book, Mastering the Art of Southern Cooking, which she co-authored with Cliff Graubart's wife, Cynthia, and Pat wrote the foreword to it. He and Natalie remained lifelong friends. My own friendship with Pat Conroy began in the 2000s when he became a mentor to me, but ultimately I had an opportunity to mentor Pat as well, and that's often the way the best student-teacher relationships work. When I had the opportunity to become the director of the University of South Carolina Press, Pat wrote a really wonderful letter of recommendation for me, which I'll share with you, not simply because it reflects well on me, although it does, but because I think it gives tremendous insight in what it was like to be championed by Pat Conroy. Dear Dr. Stephen Lynn, my name is Pat Conroy, and I'm a South Carolina writer. I've got 4 brothers and a sister who are gamecocks and consider me a much lesser man because I'm only a Citadel bulldog. I'm writing this letter in support, no, in ridiculously enthusiastic support of Jonathan Haupt for the full-time director of the South Carolina University Press position. Though I do not have to tell you this, Dr. Lynn, I believe the South Carolina Press represents the cultural heartbeat of the state. I have a long and fruitful association with it, and Jonathan Haupt recently got me to write an introduction to State of the Heart, group of personal essays by South Carolina writers, edited by Aida Rogers. The amazing thing about this fact is that Jonathan Haupt has never passed a single nickel or dime from his hand to mine. He gets me to do things by his professionalism, his complete charm, and the love of the work he does. He understands his role as a caretaker of the South Carolina experience, and he causes me to think about it as he entices me with his cobra-like fashion when he explains what new favor I can do for him. If he gets this job, I would like you to demand he never ask a single thing of me ever again. But I admire his passion and dedication for his job and his enormous dedication to getting it done right. I was once a student of the great James Dickey on your campus, and it was in that class that I learned of the central importance of the South Carolina Press. I think Jonathan Haupt is the best thing that ever happened to the press. I urge you and your community to support him and get him off my back. Very sincerely, Pat Conroy. Having this handwritten letter is a treasure. It was a wonderful thing for Pat to do. An even more wonderful thing for Pat to do, not just for me, but for so many others, was to become my partner in a fiction imprint we created together called Story River Books. And during the last 5 years of his life, when Pat Conroy didn't have to do anything for anybody, he decided he wanted to be a teacher again. And Story River Books gave him that opportunity. In those years, Pat and I collectively championed, published, edited 22 novels and short story collections together by other writers, of course. And those books have gone on to have remarkable momentum. Story River Books was Pat Conroy's opportunity to teach me everything he had learned about publishing and to learn from me everything that I knew about small press and university press publishing at that particular moment. It was also his chance to teach our Story River writers how to value and ultimately treasure readers in the same way that Pat Conroy did. And it also gave him an opportunity to teach his readers that there was another group of writers out there that they could embrace as they had embraced him. So Pat dedicated himself incredibly to Story River Books during those last years of his life. It's remarkable to see. It's remarkable to be a part of it. Ultimately, it was a transformative experience for me because it showed me what a life of service and gratitude really looked like. And I want to share a couple of the reflections from some of the Story River writers with you about what that experience meant to them as well. Here's a remembrance from Ellen Malfris, who is the writer-in-residence at the University of South Carolina, Beaufort. Conroy began gently encouraging me to complete the manuscript that became Untying the Moon as I dawdled. His nudges turned to nags, then full-blown pestering over lunches and porch talks and late-night phone calls. And when the time came for my book launch this past October, a lovely moss-draped, blue-skied garden party at the Hayward House in Bluffton, hundreds of people showed up, and surely not just for Ellen Malfris. They showed up because my buddy, my brother in Dickey, was at my side, signing the foreword he'd written for my book, because he's Conroy, because he took the time. And here's a remembrance from the novelist Mark Powell, whose fourth book, The Sheltering, was published in Story River Books. Reading Pat and later knowing him has been a life class not only in how to write, but how to live, to be loyal, to be honest, to be kind, to love the South while refusing to accept its failings and shortcomings, to pay forward what cannot possibly be paid back, to write about your family, to love your family, to look directly at all the world's horror and to face it honestly, but never to turn mean. That's what knowing Pat and reading Pat taught me and is teaching me still. Both of those essays come from a book called Our Prince of Scribes. Writers remember Pat Conroy, that I had the great honor to be co-editor of with my friend Nicole Seitz. In all, 67 writers shared their stories of what it was like to be mentored and championed by Pat Conroy, and the book has since gone on to win 14 awards. Of the 67 writers who are in the book, 54 of us have now participated in at least one event somewhere across the South, if not beyond that. But the thing we've been doing most often recently is holding these one-day Our Prince of Scribes writers' conferences as our chance to help other lifelong learners, inspired as we are by our friend and our mentor, Pat Conroy. And we'll get to do one of those at the Morris Center for Low Country Heritage at the end of this month. On Saturday, September 29th, you can join us for the next Our Prince of Scribes Writers Conference online or in person with socially distanced tables at the Morris Center for Low Country Heritage in Ridgeland. We'll be leading 4 workshops that day and also having a closing panel, and our faculty members are Stephanie Austin Edwards, now an award-winning novelist, but at one time a Beaufort High School classmate of Pat Conroy's, the aforementioned Ellen Malfris, USC Beaufort's writer-in-residence and also a novelist and poet, Sean Scapoletto, an incredible writer and teacher from Charleston, who was also Pat Conroy's research assistant for South of Broad, Brooke McKinney, who is our Conroy Center Events and Communications Coordinator and also a fine poet and writer, and our Conroy Center student intern, Holland Perryman, along with me. This is something you can still register for through our Eventbrite page or our Facebook page. Beyond that, I certainly hope you come visit us in person or online at the nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center in Beaufort, where we continue to honor Pat Conroy as a lifelong teacher and a lifelong learner. And I hope you've enjoyed this abbreviated version of the touring presentation, Pat Conroy as a Lifelong Learner. Thank you so much.